Welcome to a wild and windy Graveney Marsh. And I'm here today because about 200 metres over there behind me is supposedly the site of the actual last battle on British soil. At least that's how this particular event is described. That's up for debate, but what we do know for sure is that it was the last engagement between a British force and an enemy force on British soil. It was World War II, the Battle of Britain was raging in the skies above Kent, and on the 27th of September 1940, a detachment of soldiers billeted here were about to get the catch of a lifetime and write themselves into the history books. This is the Battle of Graveney Marsh, or Graveney Marsh, sorry. Let me know in the comments. And it happened about there. It's September the 27th, 1940. The Battle of Britain has been going on for some time, and across the rolling marshes of Kent, England, a strange and almost forgotten clash is about to take place. In the midst of the Battle of Britain, not all the fighting took place in the skies, and what was about to happen on Graveney Marsh is now, decades later, remembered as the last ground engagement involving a foreign military force on mainland Great Britain. In the autumn of 1940, some 6 months after Dunkirk, the threat of German invasion was a real concern for the British government, and RAF Fighter Command patrols were crisscrossing the southeast coast to intercept the Luftwaffe bombers anywhere they could, knowing that those bombers were targeting London and key infrastructure throughout the southeast. Among those bombers was one of particular interest to the British government, a Junkers Ju 88A-1. The Junkers Ju 88A was cutting edge, and it was fast, cruising at around 230 miles per hour, even holding its own against other fighters at the time. And it was said that in a dive, it could even outpace the Spitfire. It could essentially serve as a bomber, a night fighter, dive bomber, reconnaissance platform, heavy fighter, and a torpedo bomber. And so with its incredible performance and some of the secret new technology in its cockpit, you can see why the British government were desperate to get their hands on one. In that cockpit was the BZA, an analog computer to help with dive bombing. And that's really what the British wanted to get their hands on. Now, this particular story features one Ju-88 in particular. This bomber was only 2 weeks old and was nicknamed Euler, or Owl in German, and it was about to end up being the prize the British government had been so desperate to capture for months. That very afternoon on the 27th of September, it was returning from a raid on London. The bomber was spotted over Kent, where it had already been damaged by anti-aircraft fire during the raid. Aboard the bomber were Unteroffizier Fritz Rulland, along with his new crew, observer bombardier Sergeant Gotthard Richter, radioman/gunner Erwin Richter, who was only recently married, and belly gunner Private Jakob Reiner. And in their bomber, they'd made up a raid party of about 300 aircraft, who were soon to find themselves in a desperate battle with 20 RAF squadrons over Kent and East Sussex. They, for their part, were flying with around 18 other bombers, and their target was a gasworks in London. And the resistance put up by the RAF on this day clearly left an impact on those flying with the raiding force.
As I glanced below and slightly to the left, I could see fighters myself. I believe they had a big red circle on their wings, without white. The green camouflage paint was very dark, by that we recognized the British fighters at once. They were flying about 200 meters below us, against our flight direction. Then commenced the most hectic aerial combat I had experienced. We were attacked by fighters without a break. Often I saw several aircraft at once being shot down in flames, with black or white smoke trailing, or like red torches.
I'm actually just a little bit further down the river from Ore Marshes, which is where my Faversham gunpowder explosion happened. If you've not seen that video, go have a look at that. That was a fascinating video to make, especially because you can still see where the old gunpowder factory used to be. Also, it's difficult for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the soldiers and the people who lived here during the Second World War now. And it must have been intimidating. Especially standing here on the coastline and looking out and seeing this huge droning mass of bombers and fighters coming across the English Channel. It must have been so difficult to just sit here and watch. All in all, it was a resounding success for the RAF. The Air Ministry later reported,
"The enemy's major operations for the day were completed by this attack on London. It would have given them little satisfaction if they knew the truth. Not one of their 4 attacks was successful. Moreover, their losses had been suffered in the type of medium-altitude bombing raid that had been so successful earlier in September when mounted on a large scale. As they retired, they had relied on their own speed and evasive tactics to escape attack."
Now obviously we know the Ju-88 were very manoeuvrable and very good up against fighters. But Euler could only survive for so long before it was struck by anti-aircraft fire. The radio man, Sergeant Erwin Richter, reported that
During an anti-aircraft engagement over London, one engine failed.
that had happened over Upner Castle, where an anti-aircraft gun had successfully taken out one of the bomber's engines. Richter also recalled that because of this one damaged engine, they slowed and fell out of the formation of bombers they were flying with.
As a result, we were separated from our unit and immediately attacked by 3 fighters.
Now, it would seem that those 3 fighters were 1 Hurricane and 2 Spitfires. Although we have no details on the Hurricane, we do know that the 2 Spitfires were piloted by Sergeant Claude Arthur Parsons of RAF 66 Squadron and Sergeant Hugh Bowen Morris of 92 Squadron. The following excerpt is from Sergeant Parsons' combat report.
"I was Green 3 in the 2nd section of 66 Squadron. We took off from Gravesend at 1450 hours and proceeded to Biggin Hill, where we joined with another squadron, number 92 Squadron. We attacked the enemy aircraft east of Biggin Hill. We formed echelon port and then attacked the Ju-88s from slightly below and behind. They broke up and I chased one which turned to the port side. As I drew near, the enemy aircraft jettisoned its bombs. I attacked from the rear, giving him a short burst. I broke to the left and carried out a quarter attack on the port engine. This immediately smoked and stopped.
The bomber was simply not in a condition to stand up to the attack from these 2 Spitfires. So, Ruland decided that to give them less manoeuvrability around the bomber in the air, that they were going down anyway, why not get down lower? His logic was also that that would then mean that they were better targets for Richter, who could take them on with his rear-facing MG-15 machine gun.
Ruland dived at once, and as he neared the ground, he found that the 2nd engine had failed as the result of fighter fire.
By this point, they found themselves in a situation where they were going down no matter what happened. And they were also completely outgunned by the 2 Spitfires, who, combined, were coming at them with 16 .303 Browning machine guns.
I broke to the starboard side and carried out a quarter attack on the starboard motor. During this attack, I ran out of ammunition. The motor slowed up and the enemy aircraft started to lose height quickly.
And as they were going down, Richter became the only man to be wounded as the aircraft was crashing.
During the fighter attack, I was wounded in both eyes by glass splinters.
Now, seeing that there was no way the bomber could escape and it was definitely going down, the 2 Spitfire pilots, Parsons and Bowen Morris, decided that their job was done.
I did 2 further attacks to force the enemy aircraft down. This finally force landed on marshland between Faversham and Whitstable, north of the railway. 5 enemy airmen were seen to scramble out of the crashed enemy aircraft.
Imagining it now, I can see why my granddad used to get so excited anytime there was dogfighting happening, because you can just picture it being here now, especially as a child. And obviously we know that a lot of the locals, including local children, were privy to what was happening here. But seeing these 2 Spitfires buzzing around this bomber as they flew over here, bringing it down into the marsh here, it must have been spectacular. I mean, it's one thing seeing the Spitfires still fly over Kent today, because obviously you can go up, you pay a lot of money, and you can go up and enjoy a Spitfire experience. If anyone out there happens to be a Spitfire pilot and wants to take me up with them, feel free, that would be amazing. I'll make you an incredible video. And seeing them here today is still an incredible experience, but actually seeing them while they were doing what they're famous for, bringing down German planes as scary as it probably was, it must have been thrilling.
Back down on the ground, War Substantive Lieutenant John Cantifer was heading for a weapons inspection of one of his platoons based at Graveney. They were one of several platoons who had been each allocated a particular point between Faversham and Whitstable, and essentially their job was to be the first ground-based line of defence against a German invasion. They were patrolling the coast until any such invasion took place, and if it did, they were to delay any enemy advance along roads and try and do what they could against assaults coming from the air. And what the British government expected was that this particular area of Kent, being the closest line of coast to France and incredibly flat, they basically expected that if the Germans were to invade, it would most likely be through paratroopers landing on this bit of Kent. As Cantifer was making his way to Graveney, the conditions were clear enough that he saw the bomber coming down, and realising it was probably very close to where his soldiers were billeted, you can imagine he probably put his foot down.
Now, the soldiers who were billeted along the coastline here on this particularly, well, what was considered vulnerable stretch of coastline, obviously weren't really seeing that much action. Obviously we know they never actually had to fend off a proper invading land force. But what they were reasonably familiar with during 1940 was planes coming down in Kent. Of course, there were plenty of RAF planes that came down during the Battle of Britain, but there were of course also enemy planes. And if that enemy plane happened to come down intact, or if the crew managed to survive, then all of a sudden that became something of a prize for the soldiers who were operating in this area. And in fact, there are stories of different groups of soldiers basically competing for different prizes, different prisoners, different planes. And I suppose when your job is essentially to sit here and wait for the enemy to come to you, never being 100% sure whether that's going to happen or not, you are probably going to try and make your fun where you can. And so to a certain extent, it did sound like it was quite fun to be here, at least when something was happening.
The German bomber, what we call bellied in, hitting the ground and then sliding around 300 yards through the soft marsh. As it did, it sheared off both propellers, but came to a stop relatively intact.
Really, this couldn't have been a more perfect place for a crash landing. Really what you want if you're going to have to crash in a World War II era German bomber, it's going to be flat, soft, wet land. The only problem, of course, was that they came down within sight of the Sportsman, which is just over there, and so right within sight of the British soldiers.
Meanwhile, Cantifer had arrived at the Sportsman. When he arrived, he found that Lieutenant Yeardsley in charge had gone, along with some of the soldiers. Seeing that all the weapons that he was there to inspect were still laid out for him, he asked Sergeant P. Allworth,
They took arms, I hope?
and in response, what he got from Allworth was,
No, sir. The arms inspection, sir?
The soldiers probably couldn't believe their luck. They literally had a prize that the British government were desperate to get their hands on, dump itself about a quarter of a mile away from the pub that they were staying in. It doesn't really get much more fortuitous than that.
Back out on the marsh, the crew of the German bomber had clambered out of the wreck. They were pretty much all fine, again except for Richter's eye injuries.
And of course, they knew the predicament they were in straight away, and they knew that the British were going to try and get their hands on their plane, or at least the important bits. And knowing that they had minutes, if that, before they were under siege, the 4 German crew got to work trying to disable anything of importance on that plane.
They all had a pretty good idea that the British wanted what they had on board their aircraft. That namely being a brand new top secret BZA, or a Bombenzielanlage, a bomb targeting system. Essentially an old analog computer to assist with dive bombing. Now we don't actually know whether they had all of this on board, but again, as we'll come on to, not all the details of this story made it out intact. The Luftwaffe had very clear instructions for their pilots what to do if they were ditched on enemy territory. On board they had a Sprengbutzer 24, a roughly 1 kilogram charge of TNT with a 6-foot delay fuse. What they needed was time to set the explosives and guns to ward off the British. Now, what the Germans might not necessarily have known is that as they salvaged the guns from their aircraft, they now massively outgunned the soldiers who were coming their way. The London Irish Rifles were armed with World War I vintage SMLE bolt-action rifles. Now, these were very capable rifles and had a very fast rate of fire due to their fast reloading, but they weren't machine guns. And so the London Irish were about to come face to face with a relatively formidable foe.
It probably goes to show something of the confidence of the British soldiers, that they didn't really expect much of a fight, because from the other stories that you hear of German pilots and aircrew coming down and being captured here, they didn't usually tend to put up much of a fight. That's why there aren't countless last engagements on British soil from the Second World War, from the Battle of Britain, because it didn't really happen. There are so many stories of the British officer capturing the German pilot and being seen to drive away with him on his motorbike with the British soldier's rifle slung over the German's back. Like, there was a sense from the German pilots of, you know, well, it's a fair cop. You caught me. I'll go with you, I won't put up a fight, all of that. And so the British soldiers had probably gone out with that same attitude. They probably thought, oh, you know, we'll either not find anyone alive, or if we do, the Germans are pretty chill. They will just surrender. And so when they came face to face with heavy machine gun fire, something that, apart from training exercises, hadn't really been heard on British soil for, well, ever, you could expect they were probably a little surprised and may have regretted not bringing their guns.
As the British soldiers approached the aircraft, they were fired upon, or at least they thought they were. Again, evidence didn't necessarily back up that the Germans were firing on the soldiers, potentially more that they were actually firing upon their own aircraft. In fact, after the incident took place, the RAF Air Historical Branch actually looked into it, and their report basically said this:
Some sort of fight took place, but it is far from clear that the German crew fired at anything but their own aircraft. The crew were also said to have fired at people trying to prevent them from destroying their aircraft and coming to arrest them. This, however, cannot be confirmed and is completely denied by the crew.
But regardless, the British soldiers could hear machine gun fire, and so they responded in kind.
You can see how the locals probably couldn't have missed this engagement that was happening here. Oh, it's so open and flat that the sound of rifle fire and machine gun fire would have travelled a very, very long way.
Two local girls, Sheila and Brenda Walden, who were maybe about half a mile from the crash site, heard the beginning of the commotion.
Well, there was a battle taking place and we could see from the house that this plane came down. What did we do? We decided, got on our bikes, came round to have a closer look.
It's funny though, in very, you know, carry-on style, you can imagine, you know, a few shots ring out and a few locals, including those kids, kind of, you know, creep up just to see what's going on the marsh. And then when that heavy machine gun fire opens up, just kind of slowly backing away again. Like, all right, yep, okay, maybe not.
At this point, at the inn, Cantifer realised that something needed to be done.
Looks as if they should have taken weapons, Sergeant. Forget the inspection. I'm going over there. Tell Mr. Yeardsley and bring some of your men with rifles. And ammunition.
Clearly at this point it was realised that this wasn't going to be their usual, simple surrender. At this point, Cantifer also ran out to the marsh himself, his revolver in hand. Lieutenant Yeardsley, Sergeant Allworth, and another 10 men armed with rifles joined up with him. And from the edge of the marsh, they observed the Germans through binoculars. They could see very well that they were up to something, and so needed to act quickly.
There are quite a few people actually here out in the mud, either mudlarking or, I don't know, mud fishing, is that a thing? As you can tell, I'm not necessarily up on my mud-based activities. It's quite apparent from being here just how flat the landscape here is. Obviously, it's marshes, so all you're going to really expect is flat, wet land. But obviously, for the soldiers, that made it quite a tricky approach. They knew that the German crew of the bomber were obviously still alive, and so they couldn't just waltz straight up to it. But they did have one thing they could use to their advantage, that being the drainage ditches through the fields here behind me. Those, as wet as they are, and I'm sure they were at the time, what those provided was ready-made trenches. And so that's what they decided to do. They took to the drainage ditches.
Allworth and 5 other soldiers put down covering fire, while Yeardsley led everybody else through those ditches to get in range for a final attack. Yeardsley and the men that he was leading through the marshes got to within 50 yards of the bomber and started shooting. With the British soldiers closing in, and the Germans realising there wasn't much more they could do, and Ruland getting shot in the foot, they decided they'd done enough, and waved a white cloth for surrender. The British weren't going to take too many chances though, and kept up cover fire until Yeardsley and the other soldiers had made it to the wreck with their bayonets. The German crew immediately surrendered.
So the battle itself really only lasted about 20 minutes, probably enough time for the Germans to think, we can't really do any more to destroy this plane, so we'll just stop here.
As they were being led away, one of them warned that the bomber would explode at any moment. This was translated by a Polish soldier who happened to be with the group at the time, and now being pretty certain there were explosives around, Cantifer decided to deal with it himself. And when he found a black box that looked like it could possibly be an explosive, he knew just what to do with it.
It is quite funny to think of Captain John Cantifer finding these possibly explosive devices. You can never be too sure, especially when, stuff's smouldering and you've got some black boxes. But to think of his solution for disarming them being what pretty much every single one of us probably would have done, being, right, no, I'm just going to hoy this into a drainage ditch as quickly as I can, and then we'll get out of here as quickly as we can. I'm pretty sure most of us, if we suddenly realised we were holding an explosive device, would probably do the same thing.
Cantifer was ultimately awarded the George Medal in recognition of his bravery. And that was the end of the Battle of Graveney Marsh. Having suffered no casualties, the British were pretty chuffed with their efforts and took them back to the pub.
From where I'm standing, I can see the inn off in the distance over there. And from what it sounds like, once the Germans had surrendered, everything was pretty nice. They took them back to the pub, they gave them pints of beer in exchange for souvenirs, with one soldier mentioning that he got a nice pair of brass wings off of one of the Germans. And it sounds like it was all very, oh, what ho, good larks, well played gentlemen. One man got shot in the foot, so I think we can call it a day there. Kind of harkens back a little bit to the stories of, the First World War and playing football across no man's land. Like that kind of war as a job. We're just here doing a job, the job is over, let's just have a pint.
After the battle, locals helped soldiers remove parts of the bomber and store them until it could be taken to Farnborough Airfield, where it is presumed that they came across the BZA dive bombing computer. There is also just a little speculation that that black box that Cantifer chucked into the marsh may not have been an explosive and may actually have been that computer. And that was the last that anybody heard of the Battle of Graveney Marsh or the Junkers 88. It became another one of the many stories from the Second World War that were immediately hushed up and nobody knew anything about until decades later. At the time, the British definitely didn't want Nazi Germany finding out that they had one of their special planes. And that's the story. Or at least that's the story that we know now. London Irish Rifles Captain Nigel Wilkinson later claimed that
hardly anybody knows about what really happened at Graveney Marsh, apart from the men of the regiment and residents.
And just to put a bit of a dampener on whether this was the last battle on British soil, the RAF Air Historical Branch said the following:
that to characterise this skirmish as a battle would be something of an exaggeration.
More than 70 years after the events that day, the London Irish Rifles came back here to recreate the battle to a certain extent. Didn't properly recreate it, but they made their way back across the marshes just here where it happened to the Sportsman to unveil the plaque that sits in the Sportsman today. And it must have been nice for some of those soldiers who were originally here to come back to the scene of what, at the time, they probably couldn't have realised what would become such a historic event. It's a shame really that this story isn't more well known, but the reasons why are pretty clear. It's nice for once to have a story that doesn't end with me visiting a cemetery. Obviously during this battle only one man was shot in the foot and no British soldiers were even injured, probably just got their feet wet in some of these drainage ditches. It's nice every now and then to find little stories like this where it ended pretty much as well as it possibly could have. Nobody died. The British gained a potentially huge advantage by retrieving one of these bombers intact. And then everybody went to the pub. I don't think it could really end any better than that. Well, on that note, thank you for watching. This is a very unique story to tell from the Second World War. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any suggestions for other stories like this, or something completely out of left field for me to cover, then leave a comment below the video. If you want to buy me a coffee, because I sometimes desperately need caffeine while I'm making these, you can leave a super chat or a super thanks by clicking one of the buttons beneath the video. That'd be amazing if you could help fuel my caffeine addiction. But from the still windy and incredibly soggy Kent coastline, I'll see you in the next one.